The Vampire King's wrist split open beneath his own fangs, blood welling dark as midnight wine, and Thea Harrington knew with perfect clarity that she was about to die or become something else entirely. 2 weeks earlier, she had been ordinary. Painfully, wonderfully ordinary. A graduate student at Columbia University studying comparative mythology, spending her evenings in cramped library corners and her weekends at her favorite coffee shop in Greenwich Village. Her thesis focused on vampire folklore across cultures, an academic pursuit she'd chosen precisely because vampires weren't real, safe, theoretical, a way to study darkness without ever touching it. She'd been wrong about everything. The night it all changed had started with rain. October rain that turned Manhattan's streets into rivers of reflected neon and made her wool coat smell like wet sheep. Thea had stayed late at the library again, her eyes burning from reading 18th-century texts about Slavic bloodsuckers, and she'd taken her usual shortcut through the narrow alley behind the old cathedral on Amsterdam Avenue. That's where she'd seen him. Not the Vampire King. Not yet. Just a man in an expensive charcoal suit, too perfectly tailored, standing in the rain without an umbrella. The water didn't seem to touch him. It fell around him like he existed in a different atmosphere, and Thea had frozen mid-step because every instinct in her body suddenly screamed that something was profoundly wrong. The man turned. His eyes caught the streetlight and reflected it back like an animal's, gold and inhuman, and his smile revealed teeth that were just slightly too sharp. Thea had stumbled backward, her shoulder bag hitting the brick wall, and the man laughed. It was a terrible sound, empty of warmth, full of hunger. "You can see me," he had said, and it wasn't a question. How interesting. Most humans just walk past, their minds too dull to process what stands before them. But you. He'd taken a step closer, and Thea smelled something coppery and ancient. "You see exactly what I am, don't you, little scholar?" Thea couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Every vampire text she'd ever read suddenly rearranged itself in her mind from metaphor to manual, and the man was crossing the distance between them with impossible speed, his hand reaching for her throat when he simply stopped. Froze, more accurately, like someone had pressed pause on reality. "This one is under protection," a new voice said, and it was deeper, richer, layered with an accent Thea couldn't place. European, maybe, but older than any modern nation. "You've violated the accords, Dimitru, on my territory, hunting a marked human." The first vampire's golden eyes had widened, actual fear flickering across his perfect features. "My lord, I didn't realize she bears no visible mark. Her blood sings to those with ears to hear it. You chose not to listen." The second voice came closer, and Thea felt him before she saw him. The air pressure changed. Her skin prickled. Then he stepped into the light, and her heart stopped for an entirely different reason. He was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen, and the most terrifying. Tall, well over 6 feet, with hair so pale it seemed to glow white even in the dim alley. It fell to his shoulders in perfect waves that looked like spun moonlight. His skin was alabaster, luminous and smooth as marble, and his face could have been carved by a master sculptor obsessed with perfection. Sharp cheekbones, a strong jaw, lips that were surprisingly full and expressive. But his eyes were what held her. Deep crimson, the color of fresh arterial blood, with an intelligence and intensity that made her feel stripped bare. He wore all black. Black suit, black shirt open at the collar, black coat that swept around him like wings. And he radiated power. Not the aggressive hunger of the first vampire, but something far more dangerous. Command. Absolute authority. The bone-deep certainty that he could end anything in his path without effort. He'd turned those crimson eyes on her, and Thea had felt her knees go weak. "Go inside, little one," he'd said softly. "This doesn't concern you." But Thea had already seen too much, and her scholar's mind was racing. "You're real," she'd whispered. "All of it. The texts weren't mythology, they were history." Something flickered in his expression, amusement, perhaps, or recognition. "Go home, Thea Harrington. Forget what you've seen tonight." "How do you know my name?" "I know everything that happens in my city." He'd turned back to the other vampire, dismissing her, and Thea had run. Fled back to her tiny apartment in Morningside Heights and locked every door and window. knowing it wouldn't matter, knowing that if those creatures wanted to reach her, no lock would stop them. But she'd been alive the next morning, and the morning after that. And slowly, carefully, she'd returned to her research with new eyes. The texts weren't metaphorical after all. Every detail matched what she'd seen, the inhuman beauty, the reflected eyes, the impossible speed. And the hierarchies, lords and kings and territories and laws, someone had been protecting her. Someone had marked her blood so other vampires would stay away. The vampire with white hair and crimson eyes, the one the other had called my lord. She'd spent a week trying to find references to him in historical records, cross-referencing descriptions of powerful vampires in New York with the ancient European bloodlines mentioned in older texts. And then she'd found it. A woodcut from 1487, crude but distinctive, showing a pale-haired figure in royal regalia standing over a battlefield of corpses. The caption was in medieval German, but Thea had translated it with shaking hands. Lucien von Nachtstein, the Night King, destroyer of the Moravian clans, first lord of the blood courts. A vampire king. An actual vampire king had saved her life in a random alley, and she had no idea why. She'd tried to return to normal, attended her classes, worked on her thesis, pretended the supernatural world didn't exist, but she felt watched now, constantly. Walking home from the library, she'd catch glimpses of pale figures on rooftops. In the coffee shop, she'd notice patrons who never ordered, who sat perfectly still for hours, whose reflections in the windows seemed slightly off. And then the dreams had started. Not nightmares exactly, more like visions. She'd see vast underground chambers lit by thousands of candles, their walls carved from living rock and decorated with tapestries that looked medieval. Vampires in formal dress gathered like some dark royal court, their white hair and pale skin making them look like a gathering of ghosts. And at the center, seated on a throne of black stone, was Lucien. He looked different in the dreams, more regal, more remote. He wore a circlet of silver around his brow and robes of deep crimson that pooled around him like blood. His expression was cold, calculating, the face of someone who'd ruled for centuries and crushed countless challenges to his power. But sometimes his eyes would turn toward her, through her, and she'd feel that same electric connection from the alley, like he could see her watching, like he knew. Thea had tried to convince herself they were just stress dreams, her subconscious processing trauma, but they were too vivid, too detailed, too consistent, and she'd wake with knowledge she shouldn't have. Names, places, details about vampire politics and blood laws that weren't in any of her texts. She was connected to him somehow, to Lucien, to the vampire king. The certainty had terrified her, but it had also drawn her forward. She'd started going to the places she saw in her dreams, old buildings in lower Manhattan that looked abandoned but hummed with strange energy at night, the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, where she'd seen shadows move in ways shadows shouldn't. Washington Square Park at midnight, where she'd felt that same pressure in the air that had announced Lucien's presence. She was looking for answers, for understanding, for him. And 12 nights after the alley encounter, she'd found him. Or rather, he'd found her. She'd been in the park, sitting on a bench near the fountain, her breath fogging in the cold October air. It was nearly 2 a.m, and she'd known it was reckless to be there alone, but she'd felt pulled, compelled. "You're either very brave or very foolish," Lucien's voice had come from directly behind her, and Thea had jumped so hard she nearly fell off the bench. He'd moved around to face her, his crimson eyes catching the lamplight, and offered a slight, sardonic smile. Most humans avoid dark parks at night, especially humans who know what walks in the darkness. Thea's heart had hammered against her ribs. "I was hoping to find you." "Were you?" He'd cocked his head, studying her with an intensity that made her skin flush. "Why?" "I need answers about what you did, why you protected me, what the other vampire meant when he said I was marked." She'd stood, forcing herself to meet his gaze despite every instinct telling her to run. "And I need to know if the dreams are real, if you're sending them somehow." Lucien had gone very still. "What dreams?" So Thea had told him. About the throne room, the court, the feeling of being watched, As she spoke, his expression had shifted from curious to concerned to something darker. Troubled. That shouldn't be possible, he'd said quietly. Unless... He'd stepped closer, and Thea had held her ground, even though proximity to him made her lightheaded. May I? May you what? Touch you. Just your hand. When she'd nodded, hesitant, he'd taken her right hand in both of his. His skin had been cool but not cold, and the contact sent a jolt through her entire body. Lucien's eyes had widened. Extraordinary, he'd breathed. You're a resonant. A what? A human with latent psychic sensitivity. Rare, perhaps 1 in a million. Your blood called to me the moment you entered my territory 2 months ago. I've been keeping watch over you since then, ensuring no other vampire sensed what you are. His thumb had brushed over her palm, almost absently, and Thea had shivered. But I didn't realize the connection had become bilateral, that you could sense me in return. Why does it matter what I am? Lucien's expression had darkened. Because a resonant's blood is the most powerful substance in our world. A single vampire who drinks from you would gain immense power, enough to challenge ancient bloodlines, enough to start wars. He'd released her hand, stepping back. You're in danger. Thea Harrington. Grave danger. And I cannot protect you adequately while you walk freely in the human world. So what are you saying? That I need to hide? I'm saying you need to come with me, to the night court, where I can ensure your safety. He'd extended his hand again, palm up, an invitation. I know it's asking much, trusting a vampire, coming into our world, but I swear to you on my blood and crown that no harm will come to you under my protection. Thea had stared at his offered hand. Every rational part of her brain had screamed at her to refuse, to run, to tell someone where she was. But the dreams had shown her truth. This vampire, this king, had been protecting her for months without asking anything in return. And standing there in the dark park, looking into his ancient crimson eyes, she'd felt something that terrified her more than the supernatural revelation. She'd felt safe. Okay, she'd whispered, and placed her hand in his. The world had dissolved. That's what it felt like. Like reality unraveled into darkness and reformed around her, and suddenly she was standing in the throne room from her dreams, the vast underground chamber with its carved walls and flickering candles, but it was so much more overwhelming in person. The space felt immense, cathedral-like, and the air hummed with power. Other vampires were present, dozens of them, all turning to stare at her with various expressions of shock and hunger. Lucien had kept her hand clasped firmly in his. This human is under my direct protection, he had announced, his voice carrying absolute authority. She is resonant, she is marked, and any vampire who harms her or attempts to feed from her will answer to me personally. Is this understood? A murmur of assent had rippled through the chamber, though Thea had seen the way some of the vampires looked at her, like she was a feast they couldn't touch. It had made her skin crawl. Lucien had led her through the throne room to a side passage, then up winding stairs carved from stone, until they'd reached a door of heavy oak. Beyond it was a suite of rooms that looked like they belonged in a European palace. Rich tapestries, antique furniture, a bed with silk hangings that could have slept 4 people, a bathroom with marble fixtures, and a tub deep enough to drown in. These are guest quarters, Lucien had explained. You'll be safe here. The door locks from the inside, and only I can enter without your permission. The wards will keep out any vampire who means you harm. Thea had turned to face him, suddenly aware of how alone they were. Why are you doing this? I told you, you're in danger. No, I mean, why do you care? She'd searched his face, looking for answers in those inhuman features. I'm just a random human, one of millions in this city. Why go to such lengths to protect me? Lucien had been quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice had been softer than she'd heard it before. Because when I first sensed your blood, 2 months ago, walking past my territory, I felt something I haven't felt in 3 centuries. Interest, curiosity, the desire to know another being, not just use them or command them. He'd lifted his hand as if to touch her face, then dropped it. And because you looked at me in that alley with fear, yes, but also wonder. Like I was something worth understanding, not just a monster worth fleeing. No human has looked at me that way in a very long time. Thea's breath had caught. How long have you been alone? Too long. He'd stepped back toward the door. Rest. Feed yourself from the kitchen down the hall. Yes, we keep human food for our rare mortal guests. Tomorrow I'll explain everything properly. The politics, the danger, your options. Options? For your future. His crimson eyes had held hers. I won't keep you here against your will, Thea. But I need you to understand what you're facing before you make any choices. Then he'd been gone, the door closing softly behind him, and Thea had been alone in a vampire king's court with her entire world view shattered. That had been 5 days ago. 5 days of learning to navigate the night court, meeting the other vampires who served under Lucien's rule. His second, a cold female vampire named Seraphina with eyes like chips of gold. His master of arms, a scarred warrior named Corvus, who looked like he'd stepped out of a medieval battlefield, and dozens of others, all beautiful and terrifying and utterly inhuman. 5 days of Lucien explaining vampire law to her, the accords that governed vampire behavior in modern cities, the territories carved up between different bloodlines, the council of ancients that maintained order among their kind, and the absolute rule that resonance, when discovered, had to be either protected by a powerful vampire or eliminated because the chaos their blood could cause was too dangerous to leave unchecked. Some vampires would argue I should kill you, Lucien had told her bluntly on the third day, sitting across from her in his private study, that it would be kinder than the life you'll face now, always hunted, always marked. But I find I cannot stomach that option. Because of the connection, Thea had asked. The resonance? Partially. He'd poured her tea from a delicate china pot, a surreally domestic gesture from a vampire king. But also because I've seen too much death, caused too much death, and you, Thea Harrington, are something rare in my world. You're innocent, untouched by our darkness. I would preserve that if I can. But Thea had begun to realize she wasn't as afraid as she should be. Surrounded by vampires, living in an underground court, cut off from her old life, she should have been terrified. Instead, she'd felt fascinated. Every conversation with Lucien revealed new depths. He spoke 7 languages fluently. He'd lived through centuries of human history, witnessed events she'd only read about. He played chess like a grandmaster and quoted poetry in medieval German, and occasionally showed flashes of humor so dry she'd needed a moment to realize he was joking. And he was kind to her. Surprisingly kind. He'd arranged for her books to be brought from her apartment. He'd made sure she had clothing that fit properly, modern things mixed with more formal garments for when she needed to appear in court. He'd spent hours answering her questions about vampire nature, never condescending, treating her curiosity with respect. She'd started to forget he was dangerous, started to see him as just Lucien, the man who brought her tea and played chess with her in the evenings, and sometimes looked at her with an expression that made her heart race. That had been her mistake. On the 5th night, everything went wrong. She'd been in the throne room, watching Lucien handle court business, a dispute between 2 lesser vampires over hunting territory. It had seemed routine until one of the vampires, a cruel-faced male with silver hair, had suddenly turned toward Thea and lunged. The movement was so fast she didn't even have time to scream. But Lucien was faster. He'd crossed the space between them in a blur and caught the attacking vampire by the throat, slamming him down onto the stone floor with such force that cracks spiderwebbed out from the impact. "You dare!" Lucien had snarled, and his voice had been nothing like the cultured tone Thea had grown used to. This was the voice of a predator, of a king who'd ruled through violence and power. "You dare attack her in my presence?" The silver-haired vampire had choked out an apology, but Lucien had simply tightened his grip. Thea had watched in horror as the attacking vampire's face turned purple, then gray, his eyes bulging, and Lucien had just kept squeezing until there was a terrible wet crunch and the vampire went limp. Dead. Lucien had killed him, right there on the throne room floor. Then he'd stood, dropped the corpse, and turned to the assembled court. "Let this be understood," he'd said, his voice carrying to every corner of the chamber. "The human is mine, under my protection, under my claim. Any vampire who threatens her threatens me directly, and I do not tolerate threats." The court had bowed. Even Seraphina, his second, had inclined her head in acknowledgement. And Lucien had walked back to his throne, stepping over the body, and resumed the proceedings as if nothing had happened. Thea had fled. Back to her rooms, her hands shaking, her mind replaying that terrible crunch over and over. She'd locked herself in and tried to process what she'd seen, the violence, the casual brutality, the reminder that Lucien, no matter how kind he'd been to her, was a vampire, a killer, a creature who'd lived for centuries and probably had a body count in the thousands. He'd knocked on her door an hour later, soft, almost hesitant. "Thea, may I enter?" She'd almost refused, but she'd also realized she couldn't hide forever, so she'd unlocked the door and let him in. Lucien had looked tired, which seemed impossible for a vampire, but there was something weary in his crimson eyes. "I frightened you," he'd said quietly. "That wasn't my intention." "You killed him." Thea had wrapped her arms around herself, just crushed his throat like it was nothing. "He tried to attack you, to feed from you, possibly to drain you entirely, given the hunger in his eyes." Lucien had moved closer, cautious, like approaching a spooked animal. "I am a king, Thea. I maintain order through strength. If I'd shown mercy to a vampire who directly violated my decree, it would signal weakness. Others would try. You would never be safe. I know that logically. She'd looked up at him, searching that perfect, inhuman face. "I forgot what you are. For a few days I forgot, but tonight I remembered." Something had flickered in his expression. Pain, perhaps. "And now you're afraid of me." "Yes." She'd been honest because dishonesty seemed pointless. "But I'm also still grateful, and still fascinated, and completely confused about what I'm feeling because I know I should be running, but part of me wants to." She'd trailed off, unable to finish the sentence, but Lucien's eyes had darkened. "Wants to what?" "Understand you." It had been safer than what she'd really been thinking. That part of her had wanted to touch him, to see if his skin was as cool as it looked, to know if a vampire king could be gentle. Lucien had studied her for a long moment, then he'd done something unexpected. He'd knelt, lowered himself down so his eyes were level with hers, a position of supplication that seemed utterly wrong for a king. "I swore to protect you," he'd said softly. "That includes protecting you from your own dangerous curiosity about me. I am not safe, Thea. I am not human. Whatever you think you feel, whatever connection the resonance creates between us, it is not the foundation for anything but pain. You don't know that. I've lived 347 years. I've seen humans and vampires attempt relationships before. It always ends in death or transformation, and both are tragedies." He'd reached out slowly and brushed a strand of hair from her face. His fingers had been cool against her skin. "You deserve better than a monster's affection." "You're not a monster," Thea had whispered. "Monsters don't bring tea. They don't play chess. They don't look sad when they talk about being alone." Lucien's hand had stilled against her cheek. For a heartbeat, two, they'd simply looked at each other. Then he'd stood abruptly and stepped back. "I'll assign additional guards to your door. No vampire will reach you. I give you my word." He'd left before Thea could respond, and she'd been alone again with her confused heart and the growing certainty that she was falling for someone who couldn't or wouldn't fall back. The next 3 days had been torture. Lucien had avoided her. He'd stopped visiting for chess, stopped checking on her personally. She'd seen him only at court, where he was remote and regal and utterly unapproachable. And Thea had realized how much she'd come to depend on his presence, how much she'd looked forward to their conversations, how much she missed him. On the 8th day, Serafina had come to her rooms. The vampire second had regarded Thea with cold golden eyes and delivered a message. "The master requests your presence in his study, immediately." Thea's heart had leaped, but she'd kept her expression neutral as she followed Serafina through the winding passages to Lucien's private chambers. The study was exactly as she remembered, lined with books, dominated by a massive desk, lit by candlelight that cast dancing shadows on the walls. Lucien had been standing by the window, though there was nothing to see beyond it except solid stone. He'd turned when she entered, and Thea had caught her breath at his expression. He looked almost vulnerable. "I owe you an apology," he'd said without preamble. "I've been avoiding you, and it was cowardice. You deserve better." "Why were you avoiding me?" Lucien had been silent for a long moment. When he spoke, His voice had been barely above a whisper. Because I'm afraid. Of you. Of what you make me feel. I've spent centuries building walls around whatever humanity I have left, and you walked into my world and started dismantling them without even trying. It terrifies me. Thea had crossed the space between them before she could second-guess herself. I'm terrified, too, of you, of this world, of how much I want to stay even though I know I should leave. But I'm tired of both of us being afraid separately. Maybe we could be afraid together instead. Lucien had looked down at her, and the longing in his crimson eyes had been unmistakable. If I allow myself to care for you, truly care, I will become more dangerous, not less. I will destroy anything that threatens you. I will reshape my entire court around keeping you safe. I will become possessive and territorial and everything you should flee from. I know. Thea had reached up, hesitant, and touched his face. His skin had been cool silk under her palm. But I think maybe you already care. And I think maybe I do too. So we can either fight it and be miserable, or we can try and see what happens. You're asking me to risk your life, but his hand had come up to cover hers, holding it against his cheek. Everything in my world wants to consume you. Then we'll face it together, she'd smiled, tremulous and uncertain. Besides, I have a vampire king protecting me. I think my odds are pretty good. Lucien had smiled then, the first real smile she'd seen from him, and it had transformed his face from coldly beautiful to breathtaking. You are either the bravest woman I've ever met, or completely insane. Maybe both. He'd laughed, the sound surprised and genuine, and then he'd pulled her into his arms, held her against his chest while Thea listened to the steady, slow thud of his heart. Yes, vampires had heartbeats, just slower than human ones, and felt the tension drain from his body. I will keep you safe, he'd murmured into her hair. Whatever it costs, whoever I have to fight. You are mine now, Thea Harrington, and I protect what's mine. I'm not property, she'd protested, but without heat. No, you're far more precious than property. He'd pulled back to look at her. You're my resonant, what's the modern term? Girlfriend seems insufficient. We can work on terminology later. Thea had been grinning despite herself. For now, can we go back to the part where you were holding me? That was nice. So he had. For a few perfect hours, they'd simply been together, talking, touching carefully, learning the boundaries of this strange new thing between them. Lucien had explained more about what being a resonant meant, that their psychic connection would grow stronger, that eventually they'd be able to sense each other's emotions, that the bond was permanent once fully formed. Will it change me? Thea had asked. Make me less human? No, the resonance affects vampires more than humans. I'll become more attuned to you, more protective, more... He'd hesitated. Obsessed is perhaps too strong a word, but not by much. That should probably worry me more than it does. Probably. He'd traced her jawline with careful fingers. But I promise I will fight every possessive instinct. You are a person, not a possession. I will remind myself of that daily if I must. Thea had believed him, had felt safe in his arms despite everything, had thought maybe, impossibly, this could work. She'd been wrong. The attack came at dawn. Not that Thea could tell time in the underground court, but later she'd learn it was the moment when vampires were weakest, when even ancient ones like Lucien fell into the death-like sleep of their kind. She'd been in her rooms when the doors exploded inward. Not guards, not Lucien's people. Foreign vampires wearing black combat gear, moving with military precision. 6 of them, all with the white hair and pale skin of their kind. But their eyes were different colors, silver, green, gold. Thea had screamed, scrambling back toward the far wall, but they'd been on her in seconds, hands gripping her arms, her throat, one of them pulling out a syringe filled with something dark. Careful, one had hissed. Don't damage her. The master wants her intact. Which master? Thea had gasped, struggling uselessly against their iron grips, the one who will bring the Night King to his knees. The vampire with silver eyes had smiled, cruel and cold. You're bait, little resonant, and we're going to use you to destroy Lucien von Nachtstein once and for all. They'd jabbed the syringe into her neck. Thea had felt cold spread through her veins, and then everything had gone dark. She'd woken in chains. Heavy iron shackles around her wrists and ankles, bolted to a stone wall in a chamber that looked ancient, medieval. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness, and the air smelled of mold and old blood. Awake at last? A new voice, cultured and amused. Footsteps approached from the shadows, and a vampire emerged into the dim light cast by a single torch. He was tall, dressed in clothes that looked centuries old, with white hair pulled back in a queue and eyes the color of frost. "I am Alexander Volkov. Perhaps Lucien mentioned me?" Thea shook her head, trying to clear the fog from her mind. The drug was wearing off, but slowly. "No? How disappointing. I ruled Moscow for 200 years before he drove me out, killed most of my bloodline, scattered the survivors." Alexander had crouched in front of her, studying her face. "He made an enemy that day, little human. And now, finally, I have the leverage to make him pay." "He'll kill you," Thea had said, her voice stronger than she felt. "He'll find me and kill you and everyone who helped you." "Oh, I'm counting on him trying." Alexander's smile was terrible. "But here's what he doesn't know. This fortress is warded against vampire entry. He can't shadow step inside. He can't break through the walls. He'll have to negotiate, bargain, and I will demand everything: his territory, his crown, his submission in exchange for your life." He had reached out and gripped her chin, forcing her to meet his icy gaze. "And if he refuses, I'll drain you myself. Your resonant blood will make me powerful enough to challenge him directly. Either way, I win." Thea had jerked away from his touch. "You're insane." "I'm patient. There's a difference." Alexander had stood. "Your precious king will come for you, probably within hours, and then we'll see how much he truly values one fragile human life." He left her alone in the darkness after that. Thea had tested the chains, but they were solid iron, impossible to break. She'd tried to sense Lucien through their connection, reaching out with her mind the way she had in the dreams, but there was only static. The wards, probably, blocking her psychic signature. Hours passed, or maybe days. Time felt strange in the dark. Thea had drifted in and out of consciousness, exhausted and terrified, and trying desperately to think of a way out. Then she'd heard it. Lucien's voice, distant but unmistakable, echoing through the stone walls. "Alexander!" The roar had been inhuman, filled with such rage and power that Thea had felt it vibrate in her bones, and it had been answered by Alexander's amused voice, amplified somehow to carry. "Welcome, Night King. I assume you're here to negotiate. Release her, now, and I might let you die quickly." Bold words from someone standing outside my fortress. "You can't enter, Lucien. The wards prevent it, but I'll make you an offer. Come alone to the gate at sunset. Kneel before me. Swear fealty and surrender your territory. Do all this, and I'll let your precious human go free." There had been a long silence. Then, "I'll come at sunset. But know this, Volkov. If you've harmed her, if she's suffered one moment of pain, I will spend the next century making you beg for death." Alexander had laughed. "Sunset, then. Don't be late." The next hours had been agony. Thea had tried to stay conscious, to be ready, but the drugs and exhaustion kept pulling her under. She'd surfaced briefly when Alexander returned, dragging her upright and half-carrying her through the fortress to what looked like a courtyard. Old stone walls open to the night sky, with a heavy iron gate that glowed faintly with magical wards. Outside the gate, Lucien stood alone. He looked different, dangerous. He'd discarded his usual elegant clothes for something simpler. Black shirt, black pants, no coat. His white hair was pulled back, and his crimson eyes were blazing with barely controlled fury. When he saw Thea, saw the chains and the bruises on her wrists, something had fractured in his expression. "Let her go," he'd said, his voice deadly quiet. "Now." "Kneel first," Alexander had commanded, holding a knife to Thea's throat. "Swear your fealty. Give me your crown. Then we discuss her release." Lucien's hands had clenched into fists. For a moment, Thea had thought he might refuse, might let pride win over her life. Then, slowly, he'd lowered himself to his knees. A vampire king, kneeling in the dirt before an enemy. "I swear," he'd said, and the words sounded like they were being torn from him. "I surrender my territory, my crown, my authority, all of it, yours if you release her unharmed." Alexander had laughed. How pathetic. The mighty Night King, brought low by attachment to a mortal. You're weak, Lucien. You've always been weak. And that's why you'll... He'd never finished the sentence, because in that moment, something had happened that Thea didn't fully understand. The wards on the gate had flickered, dimmed, and Lucien had simply stepped through them like they didn't exist. Alexander had barely had time to react before Lucien was on him. The Vampire King moved with a speed that made him nearly invisible, ripping the knife away from Thea's throat and snapping Alexander's wrist with a sound like breaking branches. Alexander had screamed, and Lucien had thrown him across the courtyard into the stone wall with such force that the impact left a crater. "You made a mistake," Lucien had said, stalking toward the fallen vampire. "You assumed I couldn't break your wards, but you didn't account for the resonance. My bond with Thea acts as an anchor. Where she is, I can go. Your fortress was meaningless the moment you brought her inside." Alexander had tried to stand, but Lucien had been faster. He'd grabbed the other vampire by the throat and lifted him off his feet. "You threatened what's mine," Lucien had continued, and his voice had dropped to something terrible and inhuman. "You kidnapped her, chained her, put a knife to her throat, and you thought I would kneel and accept it?" His grip had tightened, and Alexander's face had turned purple. "I knelt to buy time, to get close enough to kill you." "Wait," Alexander had choked out. "Please, mercy, you showed her none." And Lucien had torn Alexander's head from his shoulders, just like that. Simple, brutal, final. The body had dropped, already turning to ash as vampire corpses did, and Lucien had turned to Thea. The rage in his eyes had faded instantly, replaced by concern so intense it made her heart ache. "Thea." He'd crossed to her in 2 strides, his hands gentle as they examined her chains. "Are you hurt? Did he feed from you?" "No, just scared and tired." Thea had watched as he'd snapped the iron shackles like they were made of paper. "You came for me." "Of course I came. Did you think I wouldn't?" He'd gathered her into his arms, holding her like she was something infinitely precious. "I would raise entire cities to reach you. I thought you understood that." "I'm starting to." She'd buried her face against his chest, breathing in his scent-cold stone and something faintly spicy. The kneeling thing was a trick. The kneeling thing was tactical. He'd pulled back to look at her. But if it hadn't been, if those wards had held and kneeling was the only way to free you, I would have done it, gladly. Crown, territory, pride, none of it matters more than your life. Thea had seen the truth of it in his eyes. "That's terrifying. I warned you I would become dangerous." His thumb had brushed her cheek. "You make me weak, Thea, vulnerable, and I find I don't care." They'd returned to the night court to chaos. Word of the kidnapping had spread, and the assembled vampires had been preparing for war. When Lucien had walked in carrying Thea, covered in Alexander's blood, the entire court had erupted in a mixture of relief and celebration, but Thea had been too exhausted to appreciate it. Lucien had taken her straight to her rooms, ordered a healer to examine her, and stayed by her side while Thea had finally broken down. The fear and adrenaline had caught up with her all at once, and she'd sobbed against him while he held her and murmured reassurances in languages she didn't understand. "I've got you," he'd said finally in English. "You're safe. I'm here. I won't let anything touch you again." And Thea had believed him. She'd slept for nearly 20 hours straight. When she'd woken, Lucien had been there, sitting in a chair by her bed, watching her with those intense crimson eyes. "Hey," she'd said, her voice rough. "Hey yourself." He'd leaned forward. "How do you feel?" "Like I got kidnapped by vampires and chained to a wall." She'd tried to smile, but it had felt weak. "So pretty terrible, honestly." "That's fair." He'd taken her hand carefully. "Thea, we need to talk about your safety. Alexander is dead, but his attack exposed a vulnerability. Other vampires now know you exist, know you're resonant. The danger isn't over." "What are my options?" Thea had asked, though part of her had already known what he would say. 3. "First, I can arrange for your memories to be altered. You'd forget all of this, return to your human life, and I'd ensure no vampire could find you again. You'd be safe, but ignorant." "No." The answer had been immediate. "I don't want to forget. Not you, not any of this." Something had flickered in his expression. "Relief, maybe. Second option. I can place you under permanent protection, surround you with guards, keep you in the night court indefinitely. You'd be safe, but trapped." "That sounds like prison." It would be. Lucien had squeezed her hand gently. Which brings us to the third option. Which is transformation. His crimson eyes had held hers. If you became a vampire, you'd be strong enough to defend yourself. You'd have centuries to live, to learn, to exist in our world without being prey. But it would mean giving up your humanity, your mortality, everything you were. Thea had been silent, processing. Would I still be me? Yes and no. Your personality, your memories, those remain. But your nature changes. You'd need blood to survive. Sunlight would harm you. You'd be connected to our world in ways you can't fully understand while human. He'd paused. And the transformation itself is difficult, painful. Not all humans survive it, but I'd survive it, she'd said it with certainty. Because of the resonance, right? Our bond would anchor me through the change. Lucien had looked surprised. You've been researching. I told you, I'm a scholar. When I don't understand something, I study it. She'd sat up carefully. And I've been reading every book in your library about vampire transformation. The resonance would make it easier, safer. That's why you brought it up as an option. You're too clever for your own good, he'd murmured. But he'd been smiling. Yes. With our bond, your chances of surviving the transformation are much higher. Nearly certain, actually. But Thea, this isn't a decision to make lightly. Immortality sounds appealing until you've lived through centuries of watching everyone you love die. Everyone except you, she'd pointed out. If I transform, we'd have… what? Forever? Potentially. His expression had gone serious. But I won't lie to you. Being a vampire is difficult. We're predators, killers. You'd have to feed on human blood, at least at first. You'd have to learn to control instincts that are fundamentally inhuman, and you'd be tied to me through the resonance for eternity. If I die, you'd feel it. If you die, I would likely follow. That sounds like a relationship, Thea had said quietly, just with higher stakes. The highest stakes. She'd thought about it. Her old life, her studies, her plans, all of it felt distant now, unreal. The human world had always felt too small for her somehow, and now she understood why. She'd been meant for this, for Lucien, for a world of immortals and ancient politics and supernatural power. I want to transform, she'd said, but I need some time to process everything, to be sure. Take all the time you need, Lucien had replied. I've waited centuries. I can wait a little longer. But fate, it turned out, had other plans. 3 days later, everything changed. Thea had been in the throne room again, watching Lucien handle court business, when one of his vampires had burst in with urgent news. A vampire named Dimitri, one of Alexander's former allies, had been captured trying to sneak into the Night Court's territory. Lucien had interrogated him personally, and Thea had watched as the truth came out. Alexander hadn't been working alone. He'd been part of a larger conspiracy, a group of ancient vampires who believed Lucien had grown too powerful, too dominant. They'd planned to use Thea as leverage, and when that failed, they'd move to Plan B. Poison. Dimitri had confessed to poisoning the Night Court's blood supply, a slow-acting toxin designed to weaken vampires gradually over weeks, leaving them vulnerable to attack. Most of Lucien's court had already been exposed, including Lucien himself. The news had sent the court into panic. Vampires didn't get sick easily, but certain rare substances could harm them. And this poison, according to Dimitri, was ancient, alchemical, designed specifically to target old bloodlines. Lucien had remained calm, issuing orders to secure the blood supply and find an antidote, but Thea had seen the tightness around his eyes. He was worried, and within hours she'd understood why. The symptoms started subtly. A slight pallor to Lucien's already pale skin, a slowness to his movements that hadn't been there before. By nightfall, he'd been visibly weakening, and the court's healer, a vampire named Isolde, who specialized in rare toxins, had delivered grave news. This poison is old world, she'd explained, her expression grim. Brewed by witch vampires during the Inquisition, it attacks the vampire's essential nature, breaking down the magic that keeps us animated. Without treatment, it's fatal. How long? Lucien had asked. For most vampires. A month, perhaps. But for an ancient like you, with so much power concentrated in your blood, days. maybe less. Isolde had hesitated. My lord, there is a cure, but what? It requires fresh resonant blood, a full transfusion, essentially. The psychic energy in resonant blood can purge the poison, but the process would drain the resonant completely. If they're human, they die. If they're vampire, she'd glanced at Thea, they might survive depending on their strength. Thea's stomach had dropped. So you're saying, if you were transformed, your blood could save him, Isolde had confirmed, but the transformation takes 3 days minimum. We don't have that much time. Lucien had stood abruptly. Then we find another way. There are other resonants. None close enough, Isolde had interrupted gently. None bonded to you specifically. It has to be her, my lord, or you die. Silence had fallen over the room. Thea had looked at Lucien, seen the stubborn set of his jaw, and known exactly what he was going to say. No, Lucien's voice had been final. I won't trade her life for mine. We find another solution. There isn't one, Isolde had insisted. My lord, be reasonable. I said no. He'd turned to Thea, his crimson eyes desperate. Go back to your rooms, lock the door. Don't let anyone convince you to do something foolish. But Thea had already made her decision. That night, she'd gone to him, found him in his private chambers, looking worse than before. The poison was progressing faster than anyone had predicted. He'd been sitting in a chair by the fireplace, and when she'd entered, he'd tried to stand. You shouldn't be here, he'd said. It's not safe. I'm losing control of my instincts. The poison makes me hungry. I'm not leaving. Thea had knelt in front of him, taking his cold hands in hers. Lucien, I want to do this. I want to save you. By dying? Absolutely not. I'm not going to die. She'd squeezed his hands. You're going to turn me first, right now. Then, once I'm vampire, I'll have the strength to survive the transfusion. We can do this. We can save both of us. Lucien had shaken his head. The transformation takes days. I don't have days. Then we speed it up. Isolde said the resonance makes transformation easier. Maybe it makes it faster, too. Thea had cupped his face, forcing him to meet her eyes. We have to try. Please. I can't watch you die knowing I could have prevented it. Thea, his voice had broken, if this goes wrong, if you die, I will never forgive myself. Then don't let it go wrong. She'd leaned forward, pressing her forehead to his. Turn me, Lucien. Make me yours completely, and then let me save you. He'd been silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, he'd nodded. If we're doing this, we do it properly, with witnesses, with the court's blessing, so that if anything happens, they know it was your choice. So they'd assembled the court. Every vampire in the night court had gathered in the throne room to witness what was about to happen. Serafina had looked worried. Corvus had looked grim. Isolde had prepared equipment, medical supplies, blood bags, everything they'd need for the transfusion after the transformation. And Lucien had stood before them all, Thea at his side, and explained the plan. This human has chosen transformation, he'd announced. She does so freely without coercion to save my life and join our world permanently. If any vampire objects, speak now. Silence. No one objected. No one would dare. Lucien had turned to Thea. Last chance to change your mind. Not changing it, she'd tried to smile. Let's do this. He'd led her to a private chamber off the throne room. A bed had been prepared, surrounded by candles, and Isolde had been present along with Serafina as witnesses. Lucien had sat on the bed, pulling Thea into his lap so she rested against his chest. This will hurt, he'd warned her quietly. The venom burns as it spreads. You'll feel like you're dying because, in a sense, you will be. Your human body will shut down so the vampire one can take its place. But I'll be here, every moment, anchoring you through the bond. I trust you. And she had, completely. Lucien had tilted her head to the side, exposing her throat. His hand had been gentle on her jaw. I love you, he'd murmured, so quietly that only she could hear. I didn't want to say it until you were vampire, until we were equals. But I can't wait. I love you, Thea Harrington, and I will spend eternity grateful that you walked into my world. Thea's eyes had filled with tears. I love you too. Now bite me before I lose my nerve. He'd laughed, the sound pained and affectionate, and then his fangs had sunk into her throat. The pain had been immediate and overwhelming, like liquid fire in her veins, spreading from the bite point through her entire body. Thea had gasped, her hands clenching on Lucien's arms, and he'd held her tighter. His voice had been in her mind, not her ears, speaking through their bond. "I'm here. You're not alone. Breathe through it. Let the venom work." The fire had intensified. Thea had felt her heart racing, then slowing, then stuttering. Her lungs had burned, her bones had ached. Everything human in her had been fighting the change, trying to reject it, and she'd wanted to scream. But Lucien's presence in her mind had been constant, steady, a lifeline in the chaos, and gradually the pain had begun to shift, become less unbearable. Her body had stopped fighting and started accepting, and the fire had transformed from agony to something almost powerful. It had taken hours, the longest hours of Thea's existence, but finally the transformation had completed. Her heart had stopped beating, or rather, slowed to the vampire's pace, one beat every 30 seconds. Her lungs had stilled, and when she'd opened her eyes, the world had been different, sharper, clearer. She could see every detail of the room, hear conversations happening in distant parts of the court, smell the individual scents of everyone present, and she'd felt strong, inhumanly strong. "Thea," Lucien's voice, uncertain, hopeful. She'd sat up, pulling away from his chest, and looked at him. His face had swum into focus with perfect clarity, every line, every expression, the desperate hope in his crimson eyes. "I'm okay," she'd said, and her voice had sounded different, richer. Wow. Is this how you see the world all the time?" "Yes." He'd touched her face reverently. "Your eyes changed. They're crimson now, like mine." "Like yours," she'd repeated, smiling. Then the smile had faded. "The transfusion. We need to do it now before the poison progresses further." Isolde had moved immediately, preparing the equipment. The process had been surprisingly simple. In theory, they'd connect Thea's circulatory system to Lucien's temporarily, letting her resonant, enhanced vampire blood flow into him and flush out the poison. But the execution had been complex. IV lines, monitoring equipment, careful calculation of blood volume, and all while Lucien had grown weaker by the minute. By the time Isolde had them ready, he'd been pale even for a vampire, his crimson eyes dimmed. "This will take hours," Isolde had warned. "You'll both be vulnerable during the process. Guards are posted outside, but just do it," Lucien had said hoarsely. So they had. Thea had lain beside Lucien on the bed, their arms connected by tubing, and felt her blood flowing out and into him. It had been strange, intimate. She'd felt weak quickly, the loss of blood hitting her new vampire body hard, but through their bond, she'd also felt Lucien growing stronger. The poison had fought back. She'd felt it, foreign and malevolent, trying to resist her blood's cleansing effect. But her resonant nature had been too strong. The psychic energy in her blood had burned through the toxin like light through shadow, and gradually the poison had broken down. Hours passed. Thea had drifted in and out of consciousness, always aware of Lucien's presence beside her, his hand clasped in hers. And finally, Isolde had announced it was done. "The poison is gone," she'd said, relief evident in her voice. "You're both incredibly weak, but you'll recover." Lucien had turned his head to look at Thea, and his eyes had been clear again, bright crimson, fully focused. "You saved me," he'd whispered. "We saved each other," Thea had corrected, her voice barely audible. "You turned me. I healed you. Team effort." He'd laughed weakly and pulled her closer, careful of the IV lines still connecting them. "I love you," he'd said again, "my brave, foolish, perfect resonant. I love you too, my dramatic vampire king." They'd recovered together over the next week, resting, healing, learning to adjust to their new reality as bonded vampires. Thea had discovered that transformation changed more than just her physical nature. She could feel Lucien constantly now through their connection, his emotions, his presence, even his thoughts when he let his guard down. It had been overwhelming at first, but gradually she'd learned to manage the constant flow of sensation. And Lucien had been an excellent teacher, patient, thorough, helping her understand her new abilities, how to move with vampire speed, how to manage the hunger for blood without losing control, how to use the psychic sensitivity that had been amplified by her transformation. She had also learned how to navigate the night court as a vampire rather than a protected human. The other vampires treated her differently now, with respect, even deference. She was their king's bonded resident, transformed by his blood, connected to him on a fundamental level. In their world, that made her royalty. Serafina had been particularly helpful, teaching Thea the complex protocols and politics of vampire society. "You'll need to learn quickly," she'd explained one evening. "Now that you're vampire, you're a target for anyone who wants to challenge Lucien. Harming you harms him. You need to be able to defend yourself." So Thea had trained. Combat training with Corvus, who was merciless but effective, political training with Serafina, psychic training with Isolde, and personal training with Lucien, who taught her the subtle arts of vampire seduction and manipulation that were just as important as physical strength in their world. 3 weeks after her transformation, Lucien had summoned the entire night court for a formal gathering. Thea had dressed in a gown of deep crimson that Serafina had chosen, something that made her look regal and dangerous, and stood beside Lucien's throne as he addressed his people. "3 weeks ago, I nearly died," he'd announced, "brought low by poison and treachery. I survived because of the courage and sacrifice of one human who chose to join our world to save mine." He'd turned to Thea, offering his hand. "Thea Harrington is no longer human. She is vampire. She is resonant, and as of tonight, she is my consort, my equal, the queen of the night court." The court had erupted in applause and cheers. Thea had taken Lucien's hand, let him guide her to sit on a smaller throne that had been placed beside his, and realized with sudden clarity that this was her life now. Forever. Ruling beside a vampire king, navigating immortal politics, existing in a world of blood and power and ancient magic. It should have terrified her. Instead, she felt exhilarated. That night, after the formal celebrations had ended, Lucien had taken her to his private chambers. The rooms she'd stayed in as a human were being converted into a study for her, a place to continue her research, now with access to vampire texts that humans never saw. But tonight, she stayed with him. In his space, his bed, wrapped in his arms as they lay together in the darkness. "Are you happy?" Lucien had asked quietly, his fingers tracing patterns on her shoulder. "Yes." Thea had turned to face him, studying his beautiful, inhuman features in the candlelight. "Are you?" "More than I ever thought possible." He'd cupped her face gently. "You changed everything, Thea. Walked into my world and reminded me what it felt like to care about something beyond power and survival. You made me want to be more than just a king. You were always more than that. You just needed someone to see it. And you see me. It wasn't a question. All of me. The monster and the man." "You're not a monster," Thea had insisted. "You're just a person who's lived a very long time and made hard choices. But you're also kind and protective and capable of love. That's what I see." Lucien had kissed her then, deep and thorough, and Thea had kissed him back with all the passion of her new vampire nature. The hunger between them had been intense, sharpened by their bond, and they'd made love for the first time as equals. Two vampires, two immortals, two beings who'd found each other against all odds. Afterward, lying tangled together, Thea had felt complete in a way she'd never experienced as a human. Like all the pieces of her life had finally clicked into place. "What happens now?" she'd asked. "Do we just rule forever?" "We rule. We protect our people. We face whatever challenges come." Lucien had pressed a kiss to her forehead. "But we do it together, for as long as forever lasts." "That's a long time." "Good. I intend to spend every moment of it with you." Thea had smiled and burrowed closer, content in a way that felt almost foreign. "I can live with that." And she did. They both did. The weeks stretched into months, and the months into a year, and Thea adapted to immortal life with surprising ease. She became a true queen of the night court, respected and feared, using her psychic abilities to help Lucien maintain peace among the vampire factions. She continued her research too, writing extensive texts on vampire culture that became reference material for newly turned vampires. There were challenges, of course, power struggles with other vampire lords who resented Lucien's dominance, dangerous hunts for rogue vampires who broke the accords, moments when Thea missed the simplicity of human life, though those moments became rarer as time passed. But through it all, Lucien was there. Constant, protective, devoted. The vampire king who'd risked everything to save her, who'd given her immortality and love and a place at his side. And Thea loved him more with each passing day, the bond between them growing stronger until she couldn't imagine existence without him. On the first anniversary of her transformation, Lucien had surprised her with a gift, a library. An entire wing of the night court converted into a massive personal library, filled with every vampire text he could acquire, comfortable reading chairs, and a desk where she could write. "I know you miss your research," he'd explained as she'd stood in the doorway, stunned. "And I want you to have space that's entirely yours, to study, to learn, to be the scholar you've always been." Thea had thrown her arms around him, vampire speed making the movement nearly a tackle, and kissed him breathless. "Thank you. This is perfect. You're perfect." "I'm really not," he'd protested, but he'd been smiling. "I'm possessive and territorial and mine," Thea had finished, "just like I'm yours, forever." "Forever," Lucien had agreed, and kissed her again. That night, they'd made love in her new library, surrounded by books and knowledge and the life they'd built together. And afterward, lying on the plush carpet with Lucien's coat draped over them like a blanket, Thea had felt peace settle over her completely. This was home. Not her old apartment in Morningside Heights, not the human world she'd left behind. Here, in the underground court of a vampire king, in the arms of the man she loved, surrounded by the supernatural world she'd once studied from a safe distance. "I love you," she'd whispered into the darkness. "I love you too, my queen," Lucien had murmured back. "For all eternity." And Thea believed him. Because they had eternity now, endless nights stretching ahead of them, full of challenges and joy and the deep abiding love between two souls who'd found each other across the vast divide between human and vampire. The story could have ended there. Happy ending achieved, coupled together, all major threads resolved. But life, even immortal life, doesn't stop just because you reach a moment of perfect contentment. 2 years after Thea's transformation, a new challenge emerged. The Council of Ancients, the ruling body that governed all vampire territories globally, had summoned Lucien to appear before them. It was unprecedented. Ancient vampire lords didn't summon the Night King. He was too powerful, too established. But the summons had come with grave news. A vampire named Constantine, one of the oldest in existence, had been systematically killing residents across Europe, draining them, using their power to fuel his own ambitions. He'd amassed an army of lesser vampires and was challenging the established order. The council wanted Lucien to stop him, partly because Lucien was powerful enough to do so, but mostly because Thea's existence as a transformed resident made her a target. "If Constantine learns about you, he'll come for you," Serafina had explained during the council meeting where they discussed the summons. "A transformed resident is even more valuable than a human one. Your blood would make him nearly invincible." Lucien's expression had been carved from ice. "Then we go to the council. We face this Constantine, and we end the threat." "We?" Thea had interjected. "I'm coming with you?" "You're my queen, my bonded resident. Where I go, you go." He'd taken her hand firmly. "And you're strong enough now to fight beside me. This isn't you hiding while I face danger. We face it together." So they'd traveled to Vienna, where the council maintained their ancient headquarters. Thea had seen more of the vampire world in those weeks than she'd experienced in her 2 years at the night court. The council chambers were breathtaking, carved into a mountain, protected by centuries of magical wards, filled with vampires so old they'd lived through the fall of Rome. The council itself consisted of 7 vampires, each representing a different bloodline. They'd regarded Lucien with respect and Thea with intense curiosity. One of them, a female vampire named Katerina, with hair like spun gold, had spoken first. "The Night King brings his transformed resident before us. How bold." "I bring my queen," Lucien had corrected calmly, "and we're here to discuss the Constantine threat." The council had briefed them thoroughly. Constantine was ancient, nearly as old as the council members themselves. He'd been in forced hibernation for centuries, considered too dangerous to kill, but too powerful to leave active. Someone had awakened him, and he'd immediately begun his campaign against resonance. "He believes resonant blood is the key to overthrowing our established order," another council member had explained. "He's already killed 6. If he finds your queen—" "He won't," Lucien had said flatly. "We'll find him first." And they had. It had taken months of hunting, following leads across Europe, tracking Constantine's movements through the network of vampire informants. Thea had proven invaluable. Her psychic abilities let her sense other resonants, which helped them warn and protect potential victims before Constantine could reach them. The final confrontation had happened in Prague, in an abandoned monastery that Constantine had claimed as his base. He'd been waiting for them, surrounded by his army, looking every bit the ancient monster he was. Tall, skeletal, thin, with white hair that hung to his waist and eyes like black pits. "The Night King," Constantine had greeted them, his voice like grinding stone. "And the famous resonant queen. How generous of you to deliver her directly to me." The battle that followed had been brutal. Constantine's army had attacked en masse, and Lucien's forces, the elite guard he'd brought from the Night Court, had met them. Vampire fought vampire in the monastery's halls, and Thea had discovered just how effective her training had been. She'd moved through the combat with lethal grace, her psychic abilities letting her predict attacks before they landed. But Constantine himself had been terrifyingly powerful. He'd fought Lucien directly, the two ancient vampires exchanging blows that shattered stone and sent shockwaves through the building. And slowly, Lucien had begun to lose ground. Constantine was older, and he'd consumed resonant blood recently. He was too strong. Thea had seen Lucien falter, seen Constantine's hand close around his throat, and she'd made a split-second decision. She'd reached out with her psychic abilities, not to attack, but to connect. Constantine was ancient and powerful, but he'd also consumed resonant blood that resonated with hers. She'd flooded their connection with every memory of love and connection she shared with Lucien. The chess games, the conversations, the moment he'd knelt to save her, the transformation, everything that made their bond unbreakable. And Constantine had screamed. Resonant blood amplified power, but it also created connections. And Thea had just forced Constantine to experience the depth of love and devotion between her and Lucien, emotions so intense and genuine that they burned like acid through Constantine's ancient, cynical mind. He'd released Lucien and stumbled backward, clutching his head. What is this love?" Thea had said simply. "Something you've forgotten over your centuries of existence. Let me remind you." She'd poured more into the connection. Not just her love for Lucien, but her love for her new life, for the Night Court, for the choice she'd made to become vampire. The pure joy of existence, amplified by her resonant nature until it was overwhelming. Constantine had collapsed, simply dropped to his knees, his black eyes wide with something like wonder or horror. And Lucien, recovered now, had moved in for the kill. "Wait," Constantine had gasped. "Please, I remember now. I remember what it was to care about something, someone. I remember humanity." Lucien's hand had frozen inches from Constantine's throat. "You've killed 6 resonants, destroyed countless lives. Why should I spare you?" "I shouldn't be spared," Constantine had said, and his voice had been different, softer, almost human. "But if you must kill me, know that your queen has already won. She showed me what I'd lost, what I'd forgotten. The last thing I'll feel is gratitude." Lucien had looked at Thea. She'd felt his question through their bond. What do we do? Thea had approached Constantine carefully. "If we spare you, what will you do?" "Sleep," Constantine had said. "Return to hibernation. I'm too old for this world, and I'm too dangerous to exist in it. But I'll sleep with better dreams than I've had in centuries, thanks to your gift." So they let him live. Let the council take him back into custody, back to the magical hibernation that kept ancient vampires from becoming threats. Katerina had been shocked, but approving. "You showed mercy and wisdom," she'd told Thea afterward. "You proved that a resonant queen can be more than just a source of power. You're a political force. The council will remember this." And they had. Word spread through the vampire world of how the Night King and his resonant queen had defeated Constantine without killing him, had shown mercy while still maintaining order. Lucien's reputation grew, and with it, the prestige of the Night Court. But more importantly, Thea and Lucien had proven to themselves that they could face any threat together, that their bond made them stronger than either could be alone. They'd returned to New York, to the night court, as true partners in every sense. And life had continued. Decades passed for immortals. Decades felt like years. The world changed around them. Technology advanced. Human society evolved. But the night court remained constant, a haven for vampires navigating the modern world while clinging to ancient traditions. Thea had become one of the most respected vampire queens in existence. She'd written extensively on vampire-human relations, helped establish new accords that better protected both species, and used her psychic abilities to mediate disputes between vampire territories. And through it all, Lucien had been beside her, supporting her, loving her, being the partner she'd never expected to find. On the 50th anniversary of her transformation, the night court had thrown a grand celebration. Vampires from across the world had attended, and Thea had stood beside Lucien's throne, looking out over the assembled crowd, and marveled at how much her life had changed. 50 years as a vampire, 50 years with Lucien, and she felt like they'd barely scratched the surface of forever. That night, alone in their private chambers, Lucien had pulled her into his arms. "Do you ever regret it?" he'd asked quietly. "Giving up your human life?" Thea had looked up at him, at his beautiful, ageless face, and smiled. "Never. Not for a single moment." "Even though you lost so much? Your friends, your family, your mortal dreams?" "I gained more." She touched his face gently. "I gained you. I gained purpose. I gained a life that's richer and stranger and more wonderful than anything I could have imagined in my small human existence." "How could I regret that?" Lucien had kissed her deeply. "I love you. More now than the day I transformed you. More than I thought possible." "Good," Thea had murmured against his lips, "because you're stuck with me. Forever, remember?" "Forever," he'd agreed, "and I can't think of a better fate." They'd made love that night with the passion and tenderness of a couple still deeply in love after 50 years. And afterward, lying tangled together in the darkness, Thea had felt profound gratitude for the night she'd walked down that alley and seen a vampire for the first time. For the moment, Lucien had chosen to protect her instead of letting her die, for every choice that had led them to this moment. And she knew, with the certainty that only a resonant could possess, that their story would continue for centuries more, that they would face challenges and triumphs, difficulties and joys, all of it together. Two immortals bound by love and blood and the unbreakable connection between a vampire king and his queen. Forever wasn't just a promise, it was their reality, and it was beautiful.